The wind clawed at the mountainside, an icy predator seeking entry into every crevice. Inside his snug chalet, Thomas Callahan sat before the fireplace, watching flames dance and devour the logs with a rhythmic crackle. His mountain retreat was his sanctuary, a world away from crowded streets and suffocating expectations. Yet tonight, even this solitude felt unnervingly empty. He sipped his tea slowly, letting its warmth seep through him, unaware that his quiet night would soon be shattered. A faint sound, muffled by the relentless blizzard, broke through his thoughts. It wasn't the groan of the pines or the snapping of ice. It was rhythmic, deliberate footsteps. He froze, his instincts sharpened by years of living in the wild. No one ventured to Ira Summit in this weather without a damn good reason. Grabbing a flashlight, Thomas moved to the door. When he opened it, the storm roared in like an unwelcome guest, snow swirling in frigid gusts around his feet. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, landing on a figure half buried in the snow. "What the hell?" Thomas muttered, stepping into the storm. As he approached, the figure became clearer. It was a woman, or at least it appeared to be. Her skin was green, not a sickly pallor but a glowing emerald hue that seemed to pulse faintly even under the suffocating cold. Her body trembled violently, her limbs curled inward, as if clinging to the last remnants of warmth. Silver garments clung to her, ornate but entirely unsuited for the brutal environment. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the wind. "Are you okay?" The figure stirred weakly, her head lifting just enough to meet his gaze. Her eyes glowed faintly, like twin moons wide and filled with fear. She tried to speak, but what came out was a melodic, alien cadence that sent a chill knot from the cold down his spine. Thomas hesitated for only a moment. Whatever she was dying. "You're coming with me," he said firmly, leaning down to lift her. Her body was impossibly light, almost weightless, but as he touched her, he flinched. Her skin was ice cold, despite the faint heat radiating from her core. She groaned softly, her elongated fingers clutching his jacket as he carried her toward the chalet. Inside, the warmth enveloped them both. He set her gently on the fur-covered bench by the fire. Her body convulsed with shivers, and her glowing skin dimmed as if the cold had drained her of life. Grabbing a heavy wool blanket, he wrapped it tightly around her shoulders, kneeling at her side. "Stay with me," he urged, his voice steady but laced with worry. "You'll be okay." The woman, or whatever she was, opened her mouth again, this time forming a single word, halting and fragile. "Lyra." "Lyra," Thomas repeated. "Is that your name?" She nodded faintly, her eyes fluttering shut before snapping open again. She whispered something else, broken English emerging with difficulty. "Ship broken, crash." "Crash?" he echoed, leaning closer. "Your ship? Are you saying you're not?" He stopped himself, the absurdity of the question hitting him even as he asked it. Of course she wasn't human. Lyra's lips trembled, and she tried to speak again, but her voice faltered. A single tear slid down her cheek, catching the firelight like a droplet of molten gold. The sight tore through Thomas. He had no idea where she'd come from or what she needed, but her vulnerability was unmistakable. "You're safe now," he said softly, brushing the snow from her damp hair. "I don't know who you are or what brought you here, but I'll help you. Just stay warm." Her glowing eyes locked onto his, and for a moment the storm outside seemed to disappear. She whispered again, her voice fragile. "Cold, not like home." "Where is home?" he asked, but she didn't answer. Instead, she curled further into the blanket, her body shuddering less as the fire began to work its magic. Thomas stood, his thoughts racing. He filled a kettle and set it on the stove, his hands trembling slightly. This wasn't just an injured hiker or a lost traveler. Lyra was something else entirely, something the world would probably dissect and study if they ever found her. But she wasn't just a mystery to him, she was a person terrified and alone in a world that clearly wasn't hers. He brought her a mug of steaming tea, kneeling beside her again. She took it with shaky hands, sipping slowly. Her breathing steadied, and her trembling eased. The faint glow of her skin returned, soft and rhythmic like a heartbeat. "Thank you," she said suddenly, the words clearer this time. Her gaze met his, and for the first time, Thomas noticed the depth in her eyes, a mix of intelligence, sorrow, and gratitude. It struck him how human she seemed, despite her alien features. "Why were you out there?" he asked, keeping his voice calm. "Why come here to Earth?" Exploring, she replied, her words deliberate but strained. Ship failed. Crash here. Thomas nodded, trying to piece together her fragmented story. Your ship, is it nearby? Lyra hesitated, then nodded weakly. Mountains. Buried, broken. His mind raced. A crashed alien ship somewhere on Ira Summit. The implications were staggering. But for now, Lyra was his priority. She needed to recover before they could figure out what to do next. As she sipped her tea, tears welled in her eyes again. She set the cup down and buried her face in her hands, her body trembling with quiet sobs. Hey, Thomas said gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. You're alive. Whatever happened, you survived. That counts for something. Her fingers, long and slender, lowered from her face. She looked at him, her expression raw with emotion. Alone, she said softly. Far from home. Thomas felt a lump rise in his throat. He understood isolation, the aching weight of it. But hers was a solitude he couldn't fathom, light years from everything she knew, trapped on a hostile planet with no way back. You're not alone anymore, he said, his voice firm. You've got me. We'll figure this out together. Lyra's lips quivered, and for the first time she smiled, a small, fragile gesture that warmed the room more than the fire ever could. Thomas stayed by her side, watching as her breathing slowed and her body finally relaxed. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside, the flickering firelight painted a picture of hope in the face of the impossible. The morning light crept through the frost-laden windows of the chalet, painting the room in muted hues of gold. The storm had passed, leaving behind a quiet that seemed almost sacred. Thomas Callahan stirred a pot of coffee on the stove, the rich aroma filling the small space. His thoughts churned as he glanced over his shoulder at Lyra, still cocooned in the heavy wool blanket, on the fur-covered bench by the fire. She was awake now, sitting upright, her luminous emerald eyes fixed on the glowing embers. Though her shivering had stopped, her movements remained cautious, as though every motion cost her energy. The sight of her, so foreign yet fragile, tugged at something deep within him. It wasn't pity, it was a fierce, protective instinct he hadn't felt in years. Feeling better? He asked, breaking the silence. Lyra turned to him, her gaze steady but weary. Yes, warmer. Her voice was soft, melodic, carrying a rhythm that hinted at her alien origins. Thomas poured a mug of coffee and handed it to her. She took it carefully, her long, slender fingers brushing against his hand. The faint warmth of her touch surprised him, as if her body fought to retain heat like a delicate ember in the wind. Careful, it's hot, he warned. She sipped tentatively, her glowing eyes widening slightly at the taste. This is strange, she murmured, tilting her head. Coffee. It's bitter, he explained. But it'll wake you up. Lyra studied the liquid with a curious expression before taking another sip. Bitter, but alive. She paused, her gaze drifting toward the window. The storm is gone. Thomas followed her eyes to the snow-covered world outside. The storm had left a pristine landscape, the mountains towering like ancient sentinels under the pale blue sky. The stillness was deceptive. Out here, even in calm weather, danger lurked beneath the surface, hidden crevasses, sudden avalanches, biting cold. Yeah, it's over, he said. But you're not going anywhere yet. You're still recovering. Lyra frowned, her glowing skin dimming slightly. I must find my ship. Time is important. Her insistence surprised him, but he kept his tone measured. You barely survived the storm. Heading out now is suicide. She set the mug down, her fingers tightening around the edge of the blanket. You do not understand. The ship, it sends signals. If others find it before I do, it will not be safe. For anyone. Thomas froze, her words cutting through him like a blade. Others? What others? Lyra hesitated, her glowing eyes flickering with unease. Not from this world. They are hunters. They seek what is not theirs. My ship contains knowledge they could use to harm. His mind raced, the implications of her statement settling heavily in his chest. He had thought of her as an isolated incident, a strange visitor who had stumbled into his world. The idea of more of a potential threat shattered that fragile notion. All right, he said finally, we'll find your ship, but not today. You need to regain your strength first. Her expression softened, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. Thank you, Thomas. He nodded, standing and grabbing his coat. In the meantime, I need to check the generator. If that thing goes out, we'll freeze. She tilted her head. Generator? It powers the heat, lights everything, he explained. It's old and cranky, but it works. Most of the time. Lyra rose unsteadily, her movements graceful despite her apparent fatigue. I will help. Thomas hesitated. You sure you're up for it? She nodded. I am not fragile. Her determination impressed him, and he gestured for her to follow. They stepped outside into the crisp air, their breath visible in the cold. The world was eerily quiet, the snow absorbing all sound. Lyra's iridescent skin stood out starkly against the pale backdrop, a beacon of otherworldly life in a landscape of ice. The generator shed was small and utilitarian, its metal door stiff from the frost. Inside, the machine hummed weakly, its rhythm uneven. Thomas opened the access panel, revealing a tangle of wires and frozen components. Figures, he muttered, crouching down. Ice buildup in the intake. Happens every winter. Lyra knelt beside him, her luminous eyes scanning the machinery with keen interest. This technology is primitive, she said. Thomas smirked. Yeah, well, it gets the job done, usually. She extended a hand, her fingers brushing the metal. A faint glow emanated from her palm, and the generator sputtered to life with renewed vigor. Thomas jumped back, startled. What did you just do? Lyra stood, her expression calm, repaired it. The flaws were obvious. He stared at her, equal parts amazed and wary. You could have mentioned you could do that. You did not ask, she replied simply. Thomas shook his head, chuckling despite himself. Fair enough. Remind me to keep you around. As they returned to the chalet, the sky began to darken, the brief respite of daylight giving way to the long, cold night. Inside, the fire blazed warmly, and Thomas set about preparing a simple meal: canned stew and bread. Lyra watched him closely, her curiosity evident. You live alone here, she said, more statement than question. Thomas glanced at her. Yeah, it's quiet, peaceful. She tilted her head. Peaceful or lonely? He hesitated, her words cutting deeper than he expected. Maybe both. Lyra leaned forward slightly. Why do you choose this? He sighed, his hand stilling over the stove. I lost someone. My wife. After she died, the city felt too loud, too crowded. This place gave me space to think, or not think. She nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. Loss is heavy, even across worlds. Her words hung in the air, their simplicity carrying a weight that resonated deeply. Thomas set 2 bowls on the table and gestured for her to sit. What about you? He asked as they ate. Why were you exploring in the first place? Lyra's gaze dropped to her bowl. My people, we seek understanding. We study, learn. But not all of us share this goal. Some seek power instead of knowledge. My ship was sabotaged. Thomas frowned. Sabotaged? By who? Those who do not wish for peace, she said simply. I was sent to observe, to learn from your world. They wanted to stop me. Her words sent a chill down his spine, and he set his spoon down. So this isn't over, is it? If they sabotaged you once, they could still be out there. Lyra met his gaze, her eyes glowing faintly in the firelight. They are, but I will not let them win. Thomas nodded, a sense of purpose settling over him. Then we'll make sure they don't. Together. For the first time, Lyra smiled, a small, fleeting gesture that softened her alien features. As they sat by the fire, the storm of questions in Thomas's mind quieted. For now, survival was enough. Tomorrow, they would face whatever came next. The chalet grew quiet as night settled over Ira Summit. Outside, the sky stretched wide and infinite, pinpricked with countless stars. Their light spilled through the frost-edged windows, mingling with the soft glow of the fire crackling in the hearth. Inside, the warmth wrapped itself around the room like a protective cocoon, a stark contrast to the frozen wilderness beyond. Thomas stood at the window, his mug of coffee cooling in his hands. His gaze lingered on the mountains, their snow-draped peaks, etched sharply against the darkened sky. He glanced over his shoulder at Lyra, who sat cross-legged near the fire. She was examining one of his books, her glowing fingertips tracing the printed words with fascination. Her alien beauty seemed more pronounced in the low light, her emerald skin reflecting the fire's amber hues. What are you reading? He asked, his voice breaking the silence. Lyra looked up, her luminous eyes locking onto his. It is poetry, I think, she said, her tone contemplative. The words are beautiful, though I do not understand them all. Thomas smiled faintly. Let me guess, Frost? She tilted her head. The book says Robert Frost. Is he important? To some, he said, setting his mug down and crossing the room. He wrote about nature, life choices. Stuff that sticks with you. Lyra nodded slowly. His words, they feel alive, as if they breathe. Her observation struck him, and he lowered himself into the chair across from her. You're good at picking up on things. It is my purpose, she said simply, setting the book aside. To observe, to learn. Thomas leaned forward, his forearms resting on his knees. And what have you learned so far? About us, I mean. Lyra hesitated, her glowing eyes narrowing slightly. You are complex, capable of great kindness and terrible destruction. Your species is like fire. Fire, huh? He said, raising an eyebrow. That doesn't sound entirely flattering. It is not an insult, she said, shaking her head. Fire gives life and warmth, but it also consumes. It is unpredictable, like you. Thomas chuckled softly, but her words lingered. Fair enough, he said, glancing toward the fire. What about your people? What are they like? Lyra's gaze grew distant, her expression wistful. We were once harmonious. Knowledge was our purpose, understanding our foundation. But that changed. Some of us began to seek power, using what we learned to control rather than connect. It tore us apart. Her voice carried a weight that made Thomas pause. That why you came here? He asked gently. To get away from all that? In part, she said, her voice soft. I was sent to observe your world, to see if understanding could prevail here, even when faced with differences. And what's your verdict so far? He asked, his tone light but curious. Lyra met his gaze, her expression unreadable. It is too soon to tell. For a moment they sat in silence, the firelight dancing between them. Then Lyra rose, her movements fluid and deliberate. Come with me, she said, her voice suddenly firm. Where? He asked, rising reluctantly. Outside, she said. I wish to see the stars more clearly. Thomas grabbed his coat and led her out into the cold night. The air was crisp and biting, but the sky above was breathtaking. Stars blanketed the heavens in a dazzling display, their light uninterrupted by city glow or pollution. Lyra stopped in the clearing behind the chalet, her head tilted back, her glowing skin shimmering faintly under the starlight. They are endless, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, Thomas said, standing beside her. Kind of puts things in perspective. She turned to him, her eyes filled with wonder. Do you ever feel small beneath them? All the time, he admitted. But it's a good kind of small. Makes my problems feel less important. Lyra nodded, her gaze returning to the stars. On my world, we see stars as mirrors, reflections of what was and what could be. That's poetic, Thomas said, glancing at her. You've got a way with words. She smiled faintly, her expression softening. Thank you, Thomas. The way she said his name made something inside him stir. It wasn't just gratitude, it was trust, connection. He stepped closer, his breath visible in the cold air. Lyra, he said softly. I don't know much about your world or why you're here, but I'm glad you found your way to me. She turned to him fully, her glowing eyes studying his face. You have been kind. More than I expected. I'm just doing what anyone would do, he said, though the words felt hollow. He knew better, most people wouldn't have opened their door to a stranger, let alone an alien. No, she said, her voice firm but gentle. Not anyone. You are different. Her words hung between them, the cold air sharp and still. Thomas felt the distance between them shrink, as if drawn together by some invisible force. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers. Her skin was cool but electric, a jolt of connection sparking through him. Lyra didn't pull away. Instead, she stepped closer, her glowing eyes searching his. Your touch, it is warm. And yours, he said, his voice barely audible, is something else entirely. The world around them seemed to fade, the stars above watching silently as their hands intertwined. Lyra's gaze softened, and for the first time Thomas saw something deeper, something vulnerable and unguarded. She leaned forward, her movements slow and deliberate, and pressed her forehead against his. On her world, it might have been a gesture of trust, of connection. Here it felt like something more. Thomas closed his eyes, his other hand resting lightly on her waist. The moment was fragile, tentative, and profoundly real. When he opened his eyes, Lyra's skin glowed brighter, her expression calm yet intense. Thank you, she said softly, her voice steady. for reminding me of what it means to trust." Thomas nodded, unable to find the words. He held her gaze for a moment longer before stepping back, the cold rushing in where her warmth had been. "Come on," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "We should head back before we freeze." Lyra nodded, her expression unreadable. Together they walked back to the chalet, their steps crunching softly in the snow. The stars above shone brighter than ever, their light reflecting off the mountains like a silent promise. Inside, the fire awaited, but Thomas knew something had changed. The warmth they'd shared wasn't just in the glow of the flames, it was something far more profound. The morning light filtered through the frost-covered windows of the chalet, casting fractured beams across the wooden floor. Thomas sat at the small kitchen table, absently nursing a cup of coffee, his mind racing with the revelations of the past days. Across from him, Lyra examined a crude hand-drawn map of the surrounding mountains, her glowing fingers tracing the jagged lines. "The ship should be here," she said, pointing to a marked spot near a ridge, "if it has not moved." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Moved? I thought it was buried." "It was," Lyra said, her tone even. "But the signal is inconsistent. Either the storm disrupted it, or someone is nearby." The weight of her words settled heavily between them. "If someone else finds it first," Thomas said, setting his mug down, "what happens?" Lyra hesitated, her luminous eyes flicking up to meet his. "It depends on who. My people would retrieve it carefully, using its knowledge for restoration. Others, like the hunters, they would not." "And what about us?" he asked. "What happens if we find it?" Her gaze softened, though her expression remained somber. "Then we have a chance to secure it, to protect what it holds." Thomas exhaled, pushing his chair back and standing. "Then we don't have a choice, do we? We go now." Lyra's eyebrows knitted. "The journey will be dangerous. The cold, the terrain, it will not forgive mistakes." "Neither will whoever's out there," Thomas replied, grabbing his coat. "I've lived in these mountains long enough to handle the weather. Question is, can you?" Lyra rose, her posture straight but relaxed. "My body adapts. It will manage." Something in her tone, calm yet resolute, reassured him. He grabbed his gear, a small pack, ropes, and an old but sturdy ice axe, and motioned for her to follow. Together they stepped out into the icy morning, their breath visible in the sharp air. The climb was grueling. The snow, though softened by the sun, made every step laborious, the ground uneven and treacherous. Pine trees stood sentinel, their branches laden with snow that fell in sudden bursts with the slightest disturbance. Lyra moved with surprising agility, her lightweight frame gliding over the surface where Thomas's boots sank deep. "You're good at this," he said, slightly winded as they paused near a clearing. Lyra glanced at him, her expression neutral but her eyes shimmering with faint amusement. "Observation includes physical adaptation. My body learns." "That's a fancy way of saying you're better at this than me," Thomas said, shaking his head with a grin. "Not better," she replied. "Different." They pressed on, the terrain growing steeper as they neared the ridge. The air thinned, biting at their lungs, and the wind howled through the jagged rocks. Thomas led the way, his experience guiding them through the safest paths. Lyra followed closely, her gaze constantly scanning their surroundings. "What was that?" she said suddenly, her voice low but urgent. Thomas froze, his hand instinctively gripping his ice axe. "What?" She pointed toward a grove of trees to their left. Movement. He narrowed his eyes, peering into the shadows. Could be a deer, or a mountain lion. Lyra shook her head. Too deliberate, not an animal. Thomas felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "You're sure?" "Yes," she said firmly. "We should move quickly." They increased their pace, the unease settling over them like a shroud. The ridge loomed closer, its jagged edges stark against the pale sky. When they reached it, Thomas paused, his hands resting on his knees as he caught his breath. "Your ship's supposed to be here?" he asked, his voice rough from exertion. Lyra nodded, her glowing skin dimming slightly as she scanned the horizon. "It should be there." She pointed to a snowdrift partially obscuring a jagged outcropping of metal. Thomas followed her gaze, his heart quickening. "That it?" "Yes," she said, her voice quiet but filled with something akin to reverence. "That is the vessel." They approached cautiously, the wreckage coming into clearer view. The ship was sleek and angular, its surface scorched and dented from the crash. Small fragments of metal lay scattered across the snow, glinting like alien jewels in the sunlight. Lyra knelt beside the largest piece, her glowing fingers brushing the surface. "It is damaged," she said, her tone laced with sorrow, "but intact enough." "What do we do?" Thomas asked, his eyes scanning the surroundings for signs of life. Lyra stood, her expression resolute. "We retrieve the core. It holds the ship's memory, its knowledge. Without it, the vessel is nothing." "And where's the core?" he asked. "Inside," she replied, gesturing to a hatch partially buried under the snow. "I will retrieve it. You watch for interference." Thomas nodded, gripping his ice axe tightly as Lyra began working on the hatch. She moved with precision, her fingers glowing brighter as she manipulated the alien mechanisms. The hatch groaned and creaked before sliding open, revealing an interior bathed in soft, pulsing light. "Careful," Thomas said, his voice edged with concern. Lyra nodded, slipping inside. The moment stretched long, each second feeling heavier than the last. Thomas's eyes darted to the grove of trees where she'd seen movement earlier. The snow crunched faintly behind him, and he spun around, his axe raised. Nothing. He exhaled sharply, his nerves taut. "Come on, Lyra," he muttered under his breath. "Hurry up." A faint hum drew his attention back to the ship. Lyra emerged, cradling a small, glowing sphere in her hands. Her expression was triumphant but wary. "I have it," she said. "We must leave quickly." Before Thomas could respond, a sound shattered the stillness, a sharp, mechanical whirring. His blood ran cold as he turned to see a dark figure emerging from the tree line. Its shape was humanoid, but its movements were unnaturally precise, its body encased in gleaming black armor. "Lyra," he said, his voice low but urgent. "We've got company." Her gaze snapped to the figure, her expression hardening. A hunter. Thomas gritted his teeth, stepping in front of her instinctively. "What do we do?" Lyra's eyes narrowed, the glow of her skin intensifying. "We run." She didn't wait for his response. Grabbing his arm, she pulled him toward the ridge. The hunter moved with terrifying speed, its steps crunching rhythmically through the snow. Thomas's heart pounded as they sprinted, his boots slipping on the icy ground. "Keep going," Lyra shouted, her voice cutting through the wind. They reached the edge of the ridge, where the snow gave way to a steep incline. Without hesitation, Lyra slid down, her movements fluid and controlled. Thomas followed, half sliding, half stumbling as the snow sprayed around him. Behind them, the hunter paused, its glowing visor fixed on their retreating forms. It raised an arm, and a beam of light shot out, striking the ground inches from Thomas's feet. He cursed under his breath, adrenaline propelling him forward. When they reached the base of the incline, Lyra grabbed his arm, pulling him into the cover of a rocky outcropping. Her breathing was steady, but her glowing eyes betrayed her fear. "They will not stop," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Not until they have what they seek." Thomas tightened his grip on his axe, his jaw clenching. "Then they'll have to get through me first." Lyra's gaze softened, a flicker of gratitude crossing her face. "We must keep moving. The core cannot fall into their hands." Thomas nodded, his resolve hardening. Together they disappeared into the shadows of the mountains. The hunters pursued a constant specter at their backs. The fight for survival and the secrets of the ship had only just begun. The fading light of dusk painted the snow-covered mountains in hues of rose and gold. Each breath Thomas exhaled crystallized in the air, forming fleeting clouds that vanished almost as quickly as they appeared. The weight of the day hung heavily on him as he pushed open the door to the chalet. Behind him, Lyra stepped inside, her movements measured yet graceful. The faint luminescence of her skin cast a soft glow in the dim room, accentuating the sharp contrasts of her alien features. Thomas turned to close the door, pausing for a moment to glance into the snowy wilderness. He saw nothing, no sign of the hunter or any other danger, but a sense of unease lingered. He latched the door securely and moved toward the hearth, where the fire had dwindled to embers. "We're safe for now," he said, his voice gruff from the cold. "But I'm not taking any chances." Lyra placed the ship's core carefully on the fur-covered bench, her glowing fingers lingering on its smooth surface. The sphere pulsed faintly, casting rhythmic shadows on the walls. She straightened and turned to Thomas, her luminous eyes meeting his. "You are right to be cautious," she said. "The hunter will not stop. It will seek the core until it is either destroyed or claimed." Thomas frowned, his jaw tightening. Then we have to figure out what to do with it. This thing can't stay here. Lyra nodded, though her expression remained solemn. It must be hidden. Its knowledge is too dangerous to fall into the wrong hands. And by wrong hands you mean the hunter, he asked, leaning against the kitchen table. The hunter or others like it, she said. But also your people. Your governments would see this as an opportunity for power, not wisdom. Thomas sighed, running a hand through his hair. So what's the plan? We can't exactly bury it in the backyard and hope for the best. Lyra hesitated, her gaze shifting to the core. The vessel can still be activated, though it is damaged. If I can access its systems, I may be able to neutralize the signal. Neutralize it how? He asked, his tone cautious. By fragmenting the core's energy, she explained. It will make the signal undetectable, but it will also destroy much of the knowledge it holds. Thomas stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. Destroy it. Isn't that the whole point of keeping it safe, so you can preserve what's inside? It is a last resort, she admitted, her voice heavy with resignation. But if the hunter comes too close, I will have no choice. The room fell silent, the only sound the faint crackling of the fire. Thomas's eyes lingered on Lyra, noting the weariness in her posture. She carried herself with grace, but the day's events had clearly taken their toll. You need to rest, he said, pushing off the table. I'll keep watch tonight. Lyra tilted her head, her expression softening. You have done much already, Thomas. More than I could have asked. He shrugged, trying to mask his discomfort with her gratitude. It's what anyone would do. No, she said firmly, stepping closer. Not anyone. You are different. Her words hung in the air, and Thomas felt a warmth rise to his face. He opened his mouth to respond, but Lyra continued, her voice softer now. You have risked your life for me, for something you do not fully understand. Why? Thomas hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. I guess because it feels like the right thing to do, he said, his tone uneven, and because I care what happens to you. Lyra's luminous eyes widened slightly, her glow intensifying. She studied him with an intensity that made him feel exposed, as though she could see through every defense he had ever built. You care, she repeated, her voice tinged with wonder. Thomas nodded, though he couldn't quite meet her gaze. Yeah, I do. Lyra took another step closer, the distance between them shrinking. You remind me of what my people once valued. Connection. Trust. You remind me of what I thought was lost. Her words struck a chord deep within him. He looked up, meeting her gaze fully for the first time. You're not lost, he said quietly. You're here. And we're going to figure this out together. A faint smile touched her lips, and she lifted a hand, resting it lightly on his chest. Her touch was cool, yet it sent a jolt through him, an undeniable connection sparking between them. Thomas's breath hitched, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to fade. You are extraordinary, Thomas, Lyra said, her voice barely above a whisper. So are you, he replied, his voice steady despite the storm of emotion swirling inside him. Lyra tilted her head slightly, her glowing eyes searching his face. Slowly, tentatively, she leaned forward, her movements deliberate. Thomas didn't pull away. Instead, he met her halfway, their foreheads touching in a gesture of quiet intimacy. Her breath mingled with his, and he felt the tension in his chest give way to something he hadn't felt in years, hope. The kiss that followed was soft at first, almost hesitant, but it deepened with a warmth that spread through both of them. Lyra's hands slid up to his shoulders, her touch light but electrifying. Thomas's arms wrapped around her, pulling her closer as the barriers between them dissolved. For a moment, nothing else mattered, not the hunter, not the core, not the looming dangers that awaited them. There was only the quiet, undeniable connection they shared, a bond that felt as vast and uncharted as the stars above. When they finally pulled apart, Lyra rested her forehead against his, her glowing eyes half closed. Thank you, she whispered, for reminding me of what it means to trust. Thomas smiled, his grip on her tightening slightly. You've reminded me of a lot too, he said, more than I thought I'd ever feel again. The fire crackled softly, its light flickering across the walls. Outside, the wind began to pick up, a faint reminder of the challenges that still lay ahead. But inside the chalet, there was warmth both from the fire and from the bond they had forged. We should get some sleep, Thomas said after a moment, his voice reluctant. Tomorrow's going to be another long day. Lyra nodded, though she didn't move immediately. Yes, but for tonight we have peace. Together, they settled near the fire, the core's soft glow a silent witness to the fragile, extraordinary connection that had formed between them. The night stretched on, filled with quiet breaths, and the unspoken promise that whatever came next, they would face it together. The wind howled like a predator stalking its prey, shaking the wooden walls of the chalet. Inside, Thomas stood near the window, his eyes scanning the darkened landscape. Snow whipped violently against the glass, obscuring the view, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. His grip tightened around the rifle he'd retrieved from the storage chest, a relic from a time when he thought wild animals were his greatest threat. Behind him, Lyra knelt near the ship's core, her fingers hovering above its surface. The glow from her touch pulsed in rhythmic waves, casting shifting shadows across the room. Her expression was one of intense focus, her glowing eyes narrowed as she worked. "How's it going?" Thomas asked, his voice tense but steady. Lyra didn't look up. "The core's signal is fragmented but not fully neutralized. It is unstable." "What happens if it destabilizes?" he asked, though he suspected he wouldn't like the answer. Her silence was answer enough. Thomas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "We've got to finish this before that thing finds us." Lyra looked up then, her expression softening slightly. "You have done enough, Thomas. You do not need to stay." He turned to face her fully, his eyes sharp. "Not happening. We're in this together." Lyra's gaze lingered on him, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You are stubborn." "You're just figuring that out now," he replied, a faint smile breaking through his worry. Her answering smile was brief but genuine. She returned to her task, her glowing fingers dancing over the core's surface. "I need more time." Thomas nodded, gripping the rifle tighter. "Then I'll buy you some." The first sign of the hunter's arrival was the faint mechanical whir, barely audible over the storm. Thomas's pulse quickened. He turned to Lyra, who had frozen mid-motion, her head snapping up to listen. "It's here," she said, her voice low. "Stay behind me," Thomas said, moving toward the door. Lyra stood, her glowing skin intensifying. "You cannot face it alone." "I'm not planning on fighting it," he said, though the rifle in his hand suggested otherwise. "I just need to slow it down." Before she could argue, the sound of crunching snow reached them. Thomas braced himself, positioning the rifle against his shoulder. The door rattled, the latch straining under an unseen force. A moment later, it burst open, a gust of icy wind tearing through the room. The hunter stepped inside, its dark, armored frame towering and implacable. Its glowing visor swept the room, locking onto the core almost instantly. Thomas fired without hesitation, the gunshot reverberating through the chalet. The bullet struck the hunter's chest, sparking against the metal, but doing little more than slowing its advance. "Go," Thomas shouted to Lyra. "Get out of here." Lyra didn't move. Instead, she stepped forward, placing herself between Thomas and the hunter. Her glowing hands rose, and a surge of light erupted from her palms, slamming into the hunter with enough force to send it stumbling backward. "You didn't tell me you could do that," Thomas said, his voice tinged with awe. "It is limited," Lyra said, her breathing labored, "but effective." The hunter recovered quickly, its movements precise and mechanical. It lunged toward Lyra, its outstretched arm emitting a sharp beam of light. Thomas pulled her out of the way just in time, the beam slicing through the wall behind them. "Time to go," he said, dragging her toward the back door. "The core," Lyra began. "We'll come back for it," he said. "We need to survive first." Lyra hesitated but relented, following him out into the storm. The snow was blinding, the wind a relentless force that battered against them. They stumbled through the drifts, the sound of the hunter's pursuit growing louder behind them. "This way," Thomas said, pulling her toward a rocky outcropping. They ducked behind it, the natural barrier shielding them from the worst of the storm. Lyra's glow had dimmed, her breathing shallow. "It will not stop," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Neither will we," Thomas said firmly. He scanned their surroundings, searching for anything they could use to their advantage. His eyes landed on a jagged overhang of snow, and ice perched precariously above the path they had just taken. "Stay here," he said, handing her the rifle. "What are you doing?" she asked, her tone alarmed. "Trust me," he said, giving her a brief, reassuring smile before climbing up the rocks. The hunter appeared moments later, its dark figure cutting through the white landscape like a shadow come to life. It moved with purpose, its glowing visor scanning for its prey. Thomas reached the overhang, his hands gripping a loose chunk of ice. He waited until the hunter was directly beneath him, then pulled with all his strength. The snow and ice collapsed in a thunderous cascade, burying the hunter under tons of debris. Thomas slid down the slope, landing near Lyra. "That should slow it down," he said, breathing hard. "For how long?" she asked, her glowing eyes filled with concern. "Long enough," he said. "Let's get back to the chalet." When they returned, the core's glow had dimmed significantly, its pulsing irregular. Lyra knelt beside it, her hands trembling as she worked to stabilize it. "We do not have much time," she said, her voice strained. "What happens if you can't fix it?" Thomas asked, his tone grim. Lyra hesitated, then said, "It will release its energy." "And by release you mean?" "Explode," she finished. Thomas exhaled sharply. "Great." Lyra's hands moved faster, the glow from her fingers intensifying. "I can contain it," she said. "But you must leave." "I'm not leaving you," Thomas said, his voice resolute. "You cannot help me if you are dead," she said, her tone sharp but pained. Thomas crouched beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We're in this together. Remember?" "Ah." Lyra looked at him, her expression conflicted. "You are infuriating." "And you're stuck with me," he said with a faint smile. Her lips curved into a small, fleeting smile before she returned her focus to the core. The moment stretched unbearably, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, the core's glow steadied, its pulsing rhythmic once more. Lyra sat back, her shoulders slumping with exhaustion. "It is stable. For now." Thomas let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Good. Now we figure out our next move." Before Lyra could respond, a faint mechanical whir reached their ears. The hunter had freed itself. Thomas stood, his jaw tightening. "You've got to be kidding me." Lyra rose slowly, her glow brightening. "We end this. Here. Now." Thomas nodded, gripping the rifle once more. Together. The hunter burst through the doorway, and the fight began anew.